A man who spent his career warning the West about civilizational collapse became himself the clearest example of what happens when a civilization's anxieties are mistaken for its analysis. Samuel Huntington didn't explain the post-Cold War world. He invoiced it. Samuel Huntington was a Harvard political scientist and the author of several landmark texts in American political science, most consequentially, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order, first published as a 1993 essay. His audience was the American foreign policy establishment and the broader class of serious readers who consume geopolitical analysis as a substitute for uncertainty. Strip away the apparatus, the footnotes, the civilizational maps, the measured Harvard prose, and what Huntington is doing is surprisingly simple. He is laundering anxiety into architecture. The intellectual operation proceeds in 3 steps. First, observe that people sometimes identify with cultural or religious communities. Second, assert without an intervening argument of any rigor that these identities determine the behavior of macro-level political units. Third, present the result as a structural theory of world politics. What is being sold as thought is a very sophisticated form of pattern matching. Select the world's sharpest conflicts, group them by cultural adjacency, declare the grouping causal. The method is a prosecutor's method. Evidence of guilt is assembled, evidence of innocence is not entered into the record, and the verdict is announced as if induction had occurred. Start with the scalar violence because it is foundational. Huntington observes a psychological truth: individuals experience cultural and religious identity as meaningful, and vaults from that truth to the claim that civilizations act as unified agents in world history. 7 billion interior lives collapse into 8 labeled boxes. This is not analysis. It is taxonomy costuming as explanation, committing the error in both directions simultaneously, inflating micro-level phenomena into mega-level forces while erasing everything that actually operates at the intermediate level: states, institutions, elites, resource conflicts, class antagonisms, colonial legacies. The Iran-Iraq War, 8 years, 1 million dead, Islam versus Islam, none of this registers because the unit of analysis was decided before the evidence was consulted. Then there is the metaphor, and it deserves to be prosecuted carefully because it is doing enormous illegal work. Civilizations as tectonic plates grinding at fault lines, producing earthquakes we call wars. This sounds powerful. It is a conceptual fraud. Geology implies permanence, inevitability, and impermeability. Cultures are porous, internally contested, historically recent in their current configurations, and constantly renegotiated through trade, migration, apostasy, intermarriage, and boredom. The fault line metaphor predicts friction at borders while rendering invisible the far more statistically common reality of coexistence, syncretism, and mutual indifference. Huntington does not borrow this metaphor cautiously. He builds his entire predictive logic on top of it. That is not analysis. That is a self-fulfilling cartography dressed in the language of science. The empirical scaffolding is a prosecutor selection elevated to a sampling strategy. Bosnia, the Iranian Revolution, a curated tour of the world's worst days. Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim-majority democracy, barely registers. The trillion mundane interactions between civilizations that produce nothing except commerce and tourism and mixed marriages, absent. A framework built on extreme outliers selected for dramatic fit is not a theory of world politics. It is a highlight reel. The central claim itself is not a hypothesis but a superscientific pronouncement: civilizational identity will be the primary source of conflict in the post-Cold War world. Not a source. The source. What would falsify this? Huntington never specifies which is the tell. The operational definition of civilization drifts with argumentative convenience, sometimes religion, sometimes historical memory, sometimes language, sometimes a vague cultural essence always present when needed and never precisely located. This is not theoretical flexibility. It is a framework insulated from refutation by its own conceptual fog. The internal incoherence reaches its sharpest point in Huntington's prescriptive turn. He argues simultaneously that civilizational identities are primordial, deep, and quasi-immutable, and that the West must actively defend its values through policy and military posture. But if civilizational identity is that durable, why the urgency? If it is fragile enough to require defending, it cannot be the bedrock deterministic force he claims. The theory quietly eats itself the moment it tries to generate recommendations for action. Who are we? Simply drops the scientific costume entirely. Latino immigration threatening Anglo-Protestant culture is presented through illustrative cases and a prose tone of civilizational alarm. One is not evaluating research. One is reading a worried patrician's diary reformatted as scholarship, with demographic data providing the appearance of empirical grounding and personal anxiety providing the actual argumentative force. The deepest irony is structural. Huntington's entire project presented itself as an attack on naive liberal universalism, on the assumption that one civilizational template could be projected globally. Yet his own method commits the equivalent error in reverse, projecting a singular essentialized identity onto every Muslim, every Chinese citizen, every Latin American. He escapes one false universalism by constructing 7 smaller ones, each as brittle as the one he criticized, and each conveniently organized around the anxieties of his primary readership. What Huntington consistently mistakes is salience for causation. People invoke culture loudly when they are mobilized by elites, by institutions, by resource conflicts dressed in religious costume. The loudness is evidence of the mobilization, not of civilizational determinism. He heard the noise and called it the engine. That is not a minor analytical error. That is the error, and the entire framework rests on it. Huntington was correct that the liberal triumphalism of 1989 was premature, that the assumption of universal convergence toward Western liberal democracy was ideological wish fulfillment masquerading as political science. He was also correct that cultural and religious identity constitutes a genuine variable in political mobilization, one that reductively economic or purely institutional accounts of conflict tend to underweight. These are real contributions. They deserve acknowledgement precisely because they make everything else more damning. A thinker who identified genuine blind spots in his field and then filled them with his own more elaborate, more consequential blind spots. He solved the wrong problem correctly and the right problem not at all. If you found this video useful, subscribe and leave a comment with the public intellectual you think deserves this treatment next. The list is long.